Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. In a previous video, I discussed why the role of the writer needs to be more appreciated by everyone in the comic book industry. And in this video, I'm going to talk about another underappreciated role in the comic book industry, and that is the role of the editor. Now, a lot of comic book creators, such as writers and artists, often have a love-hate relationship with their editors, and in many cases, they just hate their editors because the editors just won't let them do the things they want to do with certain characters. And what a lot of writers and artists really need to understand is that the editor's role pretty much is very important to the business of creating comics, because creating comics is a business, and a comic book is a commercial product. It is not an artistic product. It is a product that contains art for a commercial purpose, but it is a product nevertheless, and a product has to be created to maintain certain levels of standards and maintain a certain level of standards. And that's what an editor's job is to do. An editor's job is to make sure that the comics being produced are met to a certain standard of quality. So whenever they publish something, it has to not only maintain a high standard, but it also has to be consistent. And that's what the editor's job is, to make sure everything is. Their job is to make sure that the books are of a standard where the spelling is correct, the punctuation is correct, the grammar is correct, the panels are transitioning smoothly from one page to the next, the story is flowing in a way that's organic, the characters are well developed, and their job is also to make sure that the characterizations are consistent from one set of comics to another set of comics. And that means if there is a run of comics that was in the past, that the characterizations of that character and the way that character behaved in these recent issues is consistent with the way that character behaved in past issues. So you want to make sure, that's what the editor's job is, to make sure. So the editor's job is to make sure that the characterizations are consistent, to make sure that the stories are flowing organically, and to make sure that the books all are of a high quality that are coming out of the house. So the editor's job is to be the overall leader and manager of the publishing house. And a lot of people don't understand how important that role is in maintaining a catalog of characters, and how challenging it is when you have a large catalog of characters. Like at Marvel Comics, they have about 3,000 or 4,000 characters, and DC Comics, where they have about 3,000 or 4,000 characters. Now, as a guy who navigates a catalog of maybe about 200 or 300 characters, I understand how challenging that is, and you have to, and it's really the tough challenge in making sure that all those characterizations and all those stories pretty much, flow seamlessly and organically from the beginning of the first story all the way up to the current story. And that's one of the big challenges an editor has, because when you're selling comics, you're not only selling a comic, you are also selling a series. And an editor's job is to make sure that when that customer buys that end product on that most recent issue, they have the incentive to not only buy the next month's issue, but to go back and go buy the previous issues in the series. And if the reader does not see that the product is consistent, they're going to drop the book. And this is something an editor's job is, to make sure that the writer and the artist understand their role in the process of keeping things consistent. Because if things aren't kept consistent, then the customer has no incentive to buy the product. And that's where the editor's vision comes in, because the editor has to come in with a vision for the character during this run of comics. They have to pretty much set the tone for that run of comics that keeps everybody on the same page, the writer on the same page, the artist on the same page, and get them to understand that the work that they're doing is going to not only affect their run, but it's also going to affect past creators' run. And the way it affects a past creator's run is that the current books are pretty much the books that most readers use as an entry point. And if the current books aren't good, the customer has no incentive to go out and buy back issues. And that can hurt sales at your local comic shop, because a lot of comic shops They get a lot of their profits off those old issues. Now, how this affects future runs is that if the stories just aren't good of the current run, then the writers of the future run have no material to really work with when they're developing their own stories. Because when it comes down to comics, a writer has to pretty much use the stories that are given to them, and that's often what they use to mine for the future stories or the stories of the past, because the story points that are left in old issues are what they use to develop their stories currently. Now, that's the model for comic books, and the editor's job is to make sure that everything remains consistent from creative team to creative team. And I saw a great example of that with the post crisis Flash when Bill Messner Loebs was writing the Flash, and then the book transitioned to Mark Waid. Now, during that time in the 1980s, you could pick up those Wally West Flash adventures from Bill Messner Loebs to Mark Waid, and you could not see a single change in the characterization of Wally West. It was that consistent and that seamless that you could pretty much pick up any of those issues from Messner Loebs to Waid, and it was like absolutely there was no change in the character's voice. There was no change in the character's characterization. There was no change in the character's supporting cast. It was absolutely seamless. And I look at the same seamless transition when I look at old 1970s issues of David Michelin's transition to the Avengers from Jim Shooter. Now, when he took the baton from Jim Shooter, David Michelin was pretty much so seamless you couldn't tell from issue to issue who had written that comic. It was the voices and the characterizations remained that consistent. And the reason why they remained that consistent is because of the leadership of the editor. Now, a good editor pretty much is going to understand that the characters come first at a comic book business, and making sure that those characters remain consistent is important. And the reason why the editor wants those characters to remain consistent is because when those characters remain consistent, that leads to good sales long term because you're building that character up through stories and you're building that character's brand up through stories. So a good editor understands that if the characters don't remain consistent, you're not going to be able to sell comics in the long term. Because if these characters change radically, what's going to happen is people are going to look at it and go, this is not the character I grew up with. This is not the character I know. This is not something that I'm going to be eager to go out and buy. And when they see the character's voice being different and the character's actions not being consistent, they're not going to go out and buy the comic. That's why the editor isn't so important, because the editor's job is to rein in creators who want to, go in radical directions or different directions that do not fit within the confines of the character. Again, this is a commercial character, and a commercial character has to remain consistent and maintain a certain level of standards in their actions and their conduct, because when you're trying to sell a commercial character, you are managing a character for a brand, and if that character radically changes, then the customer doesn't know who they are, and then they have no reason to care about their character. And that's one of the big problems that has plagued Marvel Comics in the past couple of years. And one of the big problems that Marvel Comics has to do with editorial, and DC Comics as well. I have to mention DC Comics as well because they have an editorial problem too. Because the roots of all their problems come from, ironically, a editor who was extremely consistent. Now, a lot of people in the comic book business, they hated Jim Shooter. But however, we look at Jim Shooter's product, and it was incredibly consistent. If you look at the characterizations of the comics he wrote from that were under his supervision from 1978 to 1987, the Marvel Universe was a seamless place. It was a place where it was very tight, it was very consistent, the characterizations were consistent, the storylines were consistent, and you could literally pick up one issue and it would feature characters from another comic, and that would give you an incentive to go out and buy another comic. Unfortunately, a lot of creators were chafing under Jim Shooter's leadership, and a lot of them were very angry about the strict and stringent rules that Jim Shooter had put on people regarding stories, storylines, and how stories were told, but they couldn't see the vision that he was setting up for establishing the Marvel Universe and establishing a line of profitable products. Now, if you look at it from a business perspective, Shooter was an incredibly excellent manager. I mean, the comics that came out during that time, their quality is unsurpassed in any era. I mean, the storylines were incredibly tight. The characterizations were on point. You could go from one story like Secret Wars right to a Captain America comic or an Iron Man comic, and the voice remained the same. Spider-Man's voice remained the same. Spider-Man's actions remained the same. So you saw a consistency in the quality. You saw a consistency in the product, and you saw the product meeting a high level of quality and a high standard for quality. But a lot of people on the creative side, they didn't really like how strict Jim Shooter was. And after he left in 1987, we really started to see a lot of editors starting to not try to not be Jim Shooter. They stopped trying to be strict in maintaining a high level of quality. They stopped trying to be strict in maintaining a high standard for their products. And this is why we got a lot of the excesses we got in the late 80s and early 90s, because when it came down to a lot of the excesses we got, that was a direct result of people feeling angry at Jim Shooter, and they wanted to pretty much get away from that. And a lot of editors, like your Tom DeFalco's and many others, wanted to walk away from that structure, and they wanted to give creators more creative freedom. Unfortunately, when we look at the comics of the 90s, we start to understand why Jim Shooter's had so much strictness and how he had so many high standards for things. Because when I look at comics today as a creator and as a writer, I understand a certain rule I took from watching different chefs, and that is, you have to understand how the classics work before you can call yourself changing them. And when it comes down to a lot of creators today, they, especially the ones who came up in the 90s, they didn't understand why things were. And that's why they tell chefs not to mess with the classics or the techniques of the classics, because you have to understand that there's a reason why this is popular, there's a reason why this works, and you need to find out why that works. And that's also part of what an editor's job is, to make you sure that you understand, why this character is, why this is there, and why your idea really isn't going to fix a classic. I mean, there are certain things that just are there for a reason, like Superman's trunks, Batman's trunks. I mean, we may think it's illogical, but as an editor and as a creator, I understand why that's there, and it's up to the editor to make sure that the creators understand why that's there, because your new and improved idea is not going to change, is not going to do anything but alienate people. And this is something that many creators today don't understand, that this is there for a reason, and that you have to learn why this is there before you talk about doing things to change that. And that's an editor's job. An editor's job is to make sure that not only are things consistent, the characterizations are consistent, and that things meet a high standard, but they're there to teach, and they're also there to guide. Because writers and artists, yes, they're very talented, they're very creative people, but when it comes down to maintaining that level of quality, they have to understand what the editor's vision is, and they have to understand how certain things work in stories. Yes, you can be a seasoned writer, like I'm a seasoned writer, but you have to understand what that editor wants in that story, what their vision is. And a good editor pretty much is going to try to work with you towards, seeing their vision. They're going to be very clear about what they want. They're going to be clear about why we need to do this, and they're going to explain to you, why this has to be done a certain way, because this is a commercial product, and when you're making a commercial product, you just can't go and take your artistic licenses with it, like a lot of creators did in the early to mid 90s. Now, at DC Comics right now, we're seeing another problem with editors and their lack of leadership over there, because we have people like your Dan Didos and your Jim Lees who have no publishing experience, and we have guys like Jeff Johns who have no real publishing and management experience. And that's why the DC Comics these days, a lot of them are jumbled, a lot of them have no real vision, no real direction, is because these guys really do not understand anything about maintaining a catalog, managing a catalog of characters, maintaining a catalog of characters, and setting a vision and a tone that pretty much helps you not only sell comics, but it also sells other licensed products such as action figures and video games and other products such as films. And because there is no vision in the editorial department being set by a publishing professional or a professional, this is why the DC Comics brand has become pretty much a jumbled mess. Again, the editor's role is to set that tone, is to set that direction, and to pretty much make sure that those products are consistent, and to make sure that those creative people pretty much are on the same page that he or she is. And a lot of people don't appreciate editors, and a lot of people in the comic book industry are angry at editors because what they're trying to do is, you see a lot of editors these days, again, they're trying to not be Jim Shooter, trying to be the nice guy. Unfortunately, an editor is not a nice guy. A publisher is not a nice guy because he can't be really nice to creative people. He can be professional with them, but he can't be their friend. He can't hold their hand because he has to make sure that they're on the page of understanding that we are creating a commercial product. The commercial product has to maintain a certain standard. The product has to be consistent with the other products we produced and other products we produced in the past. For example, if we made Superman comics, Superman has to be the same as he was in past comics. His characterization, as he cannot be Bob Rogers, he always has to be Clark Kent. Clark Kent is designed to dress a certain way and act a certain way. Superman is designed to dress and act in a certain way, and his story paradigm works a certain way. So when you're working with Superman, it has to meet a certain standard. You just can't go off the page, nor can you go off the page and make radical designs and change costumes and stuff, because the customer will reject that every time. Again, there's a reason why things are classics, and you have to understand how those classics work, and that's what the editor's job is, to get artists and writers to understand, is that this is a classic for a reason. You learn the techniques for the classic, and then you go and you can create your stories around that structure. I mean, when you that's the job of the editor, is get them to understand that your new and improved is not going to work. If you want to work on this character, you have to work on that character based on the paradigms and the models set in the past, and your stories have to be consistent with that model. And you can be very creative by fitting within that model, and there's a lot of creativity, a lot of imagination that can be used. You can, create new bad guys. You can create new stories. You can create different types of adventures, but the whole thing is that the characterization of the character has to remain consistent. The design of the character has to remain consistent. And the reason why it has to remain consistent is because, again, when you're selling a commercial product to customers, customers need to recognize that character. And when you look at Marvel and DC right now, one of the big problems they have is with editorial. Editorial right now is not setting the tone. Editorial is not setting a vision. Editorial is not really setting a direction for the writers and artists to work with. They're pretty much, again, still not trying to be Jim Shooter, and they're trying to, let creators do whatever they want, and that's just not good for business. A creator, yes, they have to have a set of guidelines to work with, and the editor's job is to make sure that that creator is working within those guidelines, working within that framework, and working towards keeping that character consistent with the parameters that were established for that character by the original creators. So that's the job of the editor, and a lot of people don't appreciate that, and then because they don't appreciate it, then they wonder why this comic isn't selling, or why many creators are pretty much panned and reviled, such as Brian Michael Bendis. And the reason why he's so panned and reviled by many comic book fans is because many times he decides he wants to take the character and not make them consistent and keep their character consistent with who they were in the past. So when we look at his stories and we look at how his stories fit in with other writers, we go, the characterization isn't consistent, the story isn't consistent, and that again can pretty much give people less of an incentive to buy comics. When you have an editor who is not, willing to stand up for the characters and maintain their integrity, it can pretty much compromise the entire brand of a comic publishing house. And I see that being done at DC and Marvel right now, because when I look at their brands, the characterizations just aren't consistent. The characters aren't consistent, and everything is just a big jumble. And that really has hurt their sales on everything, not only just comics, but it's also hurt their sales of licensed products, licensed apparel, and it makes it harder to sell merchandise because, again, when you're dealing with a commercial character, you have to have easy recognition, and it's almost impossible to recognize characters these days because editorial pretty much won't make everything consistent, and it won't rate in creator excesses. A creator has a right to create at a commercial publishing house, and as the editor's job is to make sure that what they're creating, again, fits within the parameters of their commercial brand and fits consistently with how that character has been characterized in the past. So when you have a editor who is not taking charge and not looking out for the characters, what happens is you wind up with products that just aren't consistent and are of a really poor quality. So you really need to understand the role of an editor at a comic publishing house, because the role of the editor is integral to making sure that those comics you get are consistent from one creative team to the next, that the characterizations are consistent from one creative team to the next, and that the stories flow smoothly from one creative team to the next. And when they flow smoothly, then the customer will continue to buy books no matter what creator is on, but they'll buy it because they like the character and they like the character stories. That's why an editor is an integral part of the comic creative process, and that's why people really need to learn to appreciate what a great editor like a Jim Shooter does in helping with the publication of comics. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.